In February of 1959, 9 highly experienced hikers set up camp on a remote mountainside in the Ural Mountains. They went to sleep for the night, but at some point in the pitch black, something happened, something so deeply terrifying that they literally cut their own tent open from the inside and fled into the freezing subzero wilderness. Some were barely even dressed, and none of them survived to see the morning. Decades of intense forensic analysis and one of the most bizarre official death rulings in Soviet history have never fully explained what actually happened up there. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the hard facts, the highly unsettling physical evidence, and the leading theories behind the infamous Dyatlov Pass Incident.
To really wrap your head around the sheer horror of this mystery, you first have to understand the environment they were dealing with. On the night these hikers abandoned their camp, the outside temperature was estimated to be somewhere between -25 and -30 degrees Celsius. Exposure in those conditions is a rapid, merciless killer. Yet when investigators finally located the bodies, they realized that whatever drove these people from their shelter, it caused them to run right into this lethal, freezing darkness without their heavy coats, without their gear, and in some cases, without even wearing boots. You really have to ask yourself, what kind of threat entirely overrides the basic, hardwired human instinct to stay warm in -30-degree weather?
Now, you might be thinking, maybe they were just amateurs, maybe they panicked and made a fatal rookie mistake, but that theory falls apart almost immediately. This group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student, and this expedition was made up of serious wilderness experts. These were seasoned students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, and several of them actually already held advanced certifications in Soviet wilderness trekking. Their goal was to reach Gora Otorten, which was a route so notoriously difficult, completing it would earn them a Grade 3 certification. That was literally the highest category in the Soviet system. They were highly disciplined, they absolutely knew how to survive. So whatever broke their discipline that night was completely abnormal and profoundly terrifying.
The group was scheduled to send a telegram back to their sports club by February 12th. When that date came and went with no word, it wasn't immediately a cause for panic, because delays in extreme winter expeditions are actually pretty common. But days bled into weeks. Finally, a massive search and rescue operation, which even involved military personnel, was launched. And on February 26th, they found the group's tent. It was partially collapsed, buried in snow on the slope of a mountain that the indigenous Mansi people called Kolat Siyachel. Translated, that means dead mountain. The victims lay frozen and undiscovered in the snow for varying lengths of time, with the final bodies not even being recovered until the spring thaw in May.
But here is the most deeply unsettling detail the search teams discovered. The tent was cut open from the inside. Think about that for a second. They didn't pause to untie the flaps. They didn't calmly exit. They grabbed a knife, slashed the heavy canvas from within, and violently pushed their way out into the cold. This tells us definitively that they weren't being attacked from the outside by an animal or a hostile person trying to get in. No, they slashed their way out to escape an immediate, perceived threat that was either inside with them or crashing down directly upon their shelter. The panic must have been absolute.
Stepping out of that slashed tent, investigators documented a chilling trail in the snow. Footprints led away from the campsite, heading down the slope toward a nearby tree line roughly a mile away. But these prints painted a picture of desperate, uncoordinated flight. Some of the footprints showed people running in just their socks. Some were completely barefoot. Others showed someone wearing only a single boot. They didn't stop to grab sleeping bags or supplies. They just ran for an entire mile, downhill, straight into the freezing darkness.
Methodically, the search teams traced this tragic path down the mountain. Near the edge of the woods, under a large, old cedar tree, they found the first 2 bodies. They were dressed in essentially just their underwear, and they showed clear signs of succumbing to hypothermia. They had actually attempted to build a small fire. Moving back up the slope toward the tent, searchers found 3 more bodies, including Igor Dyatlov himself. Their positioning in the frozen snow strongly suggested that they had realized their mistake and were desperately trying to crawl back up the mountain to the safety of the tent before the cold finally stopped their hearts.
But this is where the mystery twists from a tragic case of exposure into something far, far darker. While those first 5 hikers found on the slope clearly died from hypothermia, the remaining 4 hikers weren't found until May. They were buried under several meters of snow in a deep ravine, much further into the woods, and they did not die quietly from the cold. They suffered catastrophic, severe physical trauma. The medical examiner actually described their chest and skull fractures as being comparable to the sheer force of a high-speed car crash. The physical evidence left behind simply defies logic. Beyond the completely inadequate clothing for subzero temperatures and those massive skull and chest fractures, there were no external skin wounds or bruising whatsoever. There were no marks of a blunt weapon, no signs of animal attack. Adding to the unease, one female victim was missing her tongue, her eyes, and parts of her lips. Now, modern researchers suggest this was likely just due to scavengers and decomposition since she lay in a running streambed for months, but it's grim nonetheless. But perhaps the most inexplicable detail of all? Forensic tests from 1959 actually detected trace levels of radioactivity on some of the victims' clothing. The pieces of this puzzle just do not fit together cleanly.
So, faced with a slashed tent, bare footprints in the snow, violently shattered ribs without any external bruising, and trace radiation, the official Soviet inquest from 1959 really struggled to find an answer. Their final conclusion was chillingly vague. They ruled that the hikers had died from, quote, a compelling unknown natural force, and then they promptly sealed the case files. That lack of transparency, coupled with the deeply bizarre, terrifying nature of the crime scene, fueled decades of intense speculation, wild rumors, and fear.
Which brings us to the leading scientific theories attempting to explain the inexplicable. Following the fall of the Soviet Union, those sealed files were finally opened up, which allowed modern researchers to truly analyze the data. One prominent explanation that emerged is the katabatic wind theory. A katabatic wind is an extremely powerful, sudden downslope wind that behaves almost like a localized, invisible hurricane falling down the side of a mountain. The theory proposes that a violent gust of this wind struck the tent in the middle of the night, deafening the hikers and causing a partial collapse of the heavy canvas. Plunged into total darkness and genuinely believing they were being buried alive or swept away, the group panicked, cut their way out, and fled downhill. By the time the wind died down, they were utterly lost, freezing, and unable to find their way back. This theory suggests some of them stumbled into that rocky ravine in the dark, which would explain the massive blunt force trauma.
Another truly fascinating, albeit incredibly eerie, scientific theory involves infrasound. Infrasound consists of very low-frequency sound waves that are entirely below the threshold of human hearing. But just because you can't hear it, doesn't mean you can't feel it. Certain wind conditions moving over the very specific, rounded shape of Dyatlov Mountains ridge could have actually acted like a giant whistle, generating immense infrasound waves. Studies suggest that exposure to these specific frequencies can chemically induce a state of sheer, unreasoning terror, panic, and severe nausea in the human brain. This could explain why highly disciplined experts would suddenly suffer a collective psychological break and flee a perfectly secure tent right into the lethal cold.
But arguably the most scientifically supported explanation among modern researchers, one heavily backed by a comprehensive study between 2019 and 2021, is the slab avalanche theory. Now, this wasn't a massive roaring wall of soft snow. Instead, imagine a compact, dense block of hard-packed snow breaking loose just above the tent. A dense slab silently sliding onto the tent perfectly explains that blunt force trauma without any external bruising. If this slab slid down while the hikers were lying flat on their backs on top of their skis, it would crush their chests and skulls against the hard ground beneath them, causing those car crash-level internal fractures without leaving a single mark on the surface of their skin. However, lingering doubts definitely remain. If their chests were crushed by a slab, how on earth did they walk a full mile into the woods? And why didn't the initial searchers find the typical massive debris field of a standard avalanche? It is the strongest theory we have, but it is certainly not perfect.
Because the scientific theories still have holes, wild speculation has thrived for decades. So it's important we briefly address what serious investigators have completely dismissed. There is absolutely no evidence of a secret Soviet military weapons test. The trace radiation was negligible and very likely just from their camping lantern mantles. The idea of an attack by the indigenous Mansi people was formally investigated and entirely ruled out. There was zero signs of a struggle, and the relations with the Mansi guides were actually highly cooperative. And of course, the various paranormal or cryptid encounters popularized by internet lore have absolutely no basis in the physical evidence left at the freezing scene.
The mystery grew so large over the years that in 2019, Russian authorities actually reopened a limited review of the case just to address the intense public interest. Their conclusion ultimately reaffirmed a natural cause explanation, aligning very closely with a combination of severe weather and that slab avalanche model. They found zero evidence of foul play. Yet, despite this modern, high-tech review, if you ask the scientists and engineers who actively study this case, they will rarely call it definitively closed.
The sheer volume of bizarre details, the slashed tent, the missing clothes in negative 30-degree weather, the trace radiation, the horrific specific nature of the injuries, it all means the data just refuses to fit cleanly into a single, neat little box.
So, we are left with one haunting question. What combination of extreme forces can completely break the iron discipline of wilderness experts, forcing them out into a freezing death and leaving behind a 60-year trail of incomplete answers? 9 hikers went to sleep on Kholat Syakhl, entirely prepared for the bitter cold, but something waited in the dark that forced them to desperately cut their way out of their only shelter. And while modern science has given us our best guesses, we have to confront the unsettling reality that we may never truly know what came for them on Dead Mountain.